Humans like to tame the untamable, the wildest of the wild beasts. But the world outside has its own rules, and those rules are not human. People have a tendency to compare things, and sometimes those things are animals, who's bigger, faster, or stronger. When it comes to big cats, few can rival the tiger. There isn't much of a size difference between a tiger and a lion, but ancient depictions of the big cats fighting in the Roman Colosseum usually show the tiger winning. In 2011, a tiger in the Ankara Zoo in Turkey found a gap in a fence, entered a lion's enclosure, and killed the lion. While a tiger would almost always win a one-on-one fight, lions don't really do things one-on-one. Lions are unique in that they are the most social of the big cats, living in groups called prides that sometimes contain 15 lions, or in rare cases, super prides of up to 30 lions. These apex predators don't usually target humans, but when they do, the results are devastating. In my first ever video, I talked about the Champawat tiger, which killed more than 300 people. If a single big cat can cause that much damage, what happens when multiple big cats work together? Most of you have likely heard of the infamous man-eating lions of Tsavo, which killed over 100 people within 9 months. But imagine a scenario where an entire pride of 20 lions turned to hunting humans, and what if they weren't stopped for years? This brings us to the chilling story of the Njombe man-eating lions. Our story begins with a man named George Rushby. Born in England in 1900, George moved to Africa while still young. His early years were marked by questionable activities, including poaching and prospecting, but for our purposes we meet him when he was filling in as a ranger at headquarters. Desk work didn't suit George. He preferred action over paperwork. One day the main warden of the area, Monty, summoned George for a meeting. Monty informed George that Dusty Arundel, the ranger in charge of the Southern Highlands, had fallen ill and returned to England. While Monty initially sought George's advice on who could replace Dusty, George volunteered for the role himself. Monty agreed, but warned, "There's a matter down there that needs some definite cleaning up, those Njombe lions." By this time, World War II had just ended, and the lions had already been preying on humans for years. George had heard of them and asked why Dusty hadn't managed to deal with the situation. Monty didn't have a clear answer, but mentioned that the man-eaters were tied up in some sort of witchcraft. This took George by surprise. There were local beliefs about lion men. Certain witch doctors were rumored to possess the ability to control lions or even transform into lions to kill their enemies or those who wronged them. While the Njombe lions were undoubtedly real animals, such superstitions complicated efforts to address the crisis. Adding to the challenge, many locals believed that simply mentioning a man-eater could make the speaker its next victim. When George arrived in Mbeya, this fear rendered most people unwilling to assist him. Reports indicated that the lions operated along the Great North Road near the southern edge of Buhoro Flats. George, familiar with the area from his earlier hunting expeditions in Tanganyika. After George arrived at Njombe's administrative station, a picturesque settlement nestled in green hills with a small waterfall. Inside, things turned grim when he met Wenban Smith, who revealed that the district was falling apart. The lions had been terrorizing the area since at least 1932, killing indiscriminately. Rumors tied the attacks to black magic, but no evidence suggested anything other than lions. Wenban Smith estimated over 1,500 deaths, with one sub-chief recording 230 deaths in just 4 years. Despite police and Game Scouts' efforts, no lions had been killed. It wasn't until January 1946 that he could dedicate himself fully to the hunt. He and his team set up trap guns and searched tirelessly for weeks, but the lions proved elusive. They avoided villages they had already attacked, often dispersing after each strike. The locals recounted harrowing tales of the lions' audacity, including breaking into huts, dragging people away, and sometimes killing for sport. Curiously, the lions frequently ignored livestock, focusing almost exclusively on humans. The longer George went without success, the stronger the locals' belief grew that the lions were invincible. George had always admired the courage of the villagers who lived under constant threat from the lions, but one individual stood out, a young girl no older than 12. Despite her age, she had proven invaluable during George's earlier investigations. While others hesitated to speak out of fear, she had approached him with quiet determination, recounting sightings of the lions near the river and describing their patterns. Her observations had helped him narrow down potential hunting grounds, earning his deep respect. To show his gratitude, George had promised to bring her sweets from England the next time he returned. Eventually, George followed a fresh trail with a few villagers leading to a clearing where 4 lions rested. He fired at a lioness, wounding her while the others fled. Determined to ensure at least one kill, George shot the lioness twice more, ending the hunt, for now. The next step was exposure. George instructed his men to bring the local villagers to witness as he skinned the lion and took its skull to offer as a trophy. It was important to him to show the locals that these were just animals, not lion men or evil spirits. Shortly after, George received a message that the man-eaters were operating at Njombe Musas, with people being killed nightly over the last few days. He traveled to the area and met up with 2 scouts who were visibly frustrated by the lack of help from the locals. Apparently, some believed hunting the man-eaters was a bad idea and would only provoke them further. For the next 3 days, George and the scouts hunted the lions but came up empty-handed. At this point, George was almost hoping the lions would attack him just so he could finally locate and kill them. On the morning of the 4th day, they discovered a large number of fresh tracks indicating that many lions were nearby. Though they still couldn't determine the exact size of the pride, they pursued regardless. They soon encountered a healthy young male at the rear of the group. The lion noticed them and growled, but the 3 men fired simultaneously. It was impossible to tell who had delivered the fatal shot, but George insisted the scouts take credit. To him, it was essential for the locals to see that these lions could indeed be stopped. After this success, George had to return to Njombe for administrative duties, including overseeing the big border fence project. A month and a half later, George returned to the area, learning that during his absence, a game scout had killed another man-eater, another rearguard lion of the pride. George spent 5 days hunting without success and decided to visit the Njombe administrative building for an update. He also hoped to discuss the witchcraft rumors he'd heard since his return to the area. Supposedly, there was a movement to reinstate Matamula, the witch doctor and former chief, as he had allegedly claimed he would call off his lions if his position were restored. Before reaching the Njombe office, George stopped at a small village for news of recent killings. Something felt off about the place. No children were in sight, women stood silently in doorways, and a few armed men kept watch on the surrounding brush. A lion had been spotted nearby. George took some of the men to track it while others stayed behind to guard the village. After several hours, they found another lone male lion. As they approached, someone made a noise and the lion immediately charged. Unlike other lions that roared or curiously observed, this one launched its attack without hesitation. George's first shot hit the dirt, but his second shot struck the lion in the head when it was less than 10 yards away. He stayed in the area for another 3 days, hunting by day and sleeping in his truck at night, but found no more lions. Continuing to the Njombe office, George asked Wenban Smith if the killings had decreased since 4 lions had been taken out. The answer was disheartening. The killings had only slightly diminished. The 2 men also discussed Matamula and the growing black magic rumors. Wenban Smith had heard about the push to reinstate Matamula but opposed it, noting that his replacement, Ulaya, was reportedly doing a good job. Furthermore, reinstating Matamula could be interpreted as an admission that the lions were a product of black magic, which the administration refused to endorse. While at the Njombe office, George received a letter instructing him to return to Mbeya once again. Civil servants in Tanganyika had been granted 6 months' leave, and George was to board a British India liner and sail back to Britain. His wife, Eleanor, had already begun packing, and their younger children were doing the same. It had been 8 years since they'd seen their older children, who were in boarding school in Britain. George decided to take the leave, trusting his temporary replacement, Twiga Rogers, to address the lions in his absence. On his way back to Mbeya, George made a detour to visit Matamula. The village of Iyayi, where Matamula lived, was along the route, and George's scouts had pointed out his house several times. Parking his truck, George walked to the house and called out a greeting. Matamula, a muscular, clean-shaven man of about 40, emerged wearing a white kanzu. George introduced himself as a game ranger and attempted to discuss his work, but Matamula deftly steered the conversation away from grim topics. After a brief polite exchange, George turned to leave but casually mentioned that 4 lions had already been killed and suggested the man-eaters wouldn't be at large much longer. Matamala smiled faintly and responded with a single word, perhaps. When George returned 6 months later, 1 more lion had been taken out. Twiga, his temporary replacement, informed him that the lion attacks had continued at nearly the same frequency. George finally returned to the Njombe district. He told his wife he would stay there until the lions were dealt with, leaving her and their young children safely in Mbeya. Upon meeting with Jafiki, George learned that attacks had decreased slightly, but 19 people had been killed during his absence. Jafiki also mentioned that there was still significant pressure from some locals to reinstate Matamula as their chief. Determined to put an end to the lion menace, George decided to camp in the area with one of his scouts. He went to visit a young girl who had previously helped him, bringing sweets from England as a token of thanks. Tragically, the villagers informed him that she had been killed by the lions just 4 days earlier. Fueled by anger and grief, George and his scout began tracking the lions the next day. By the 3rd day, they found a trail leading north and quickly followed it. They caught up with the pride around midday. This time they adopted a new strategy. Instead of concentrating fire on one lion, they aimed at different ones to maximize their chances. They managed to kill 2 lions and wound a 3rd, which escaped. Before George could continue the hunt, he was called away to investigate the death of a foreman named Marshall, who had been trampled by an elephant. Administrative duties kept him in Mbeya for months, and he wasn't able to return to Njombe until November. During his absence, 3 more man-eaters had been killed, bringing the total to 8. Jafiki reported that the number of attacks had halved, but the killings continued. George studied a map of recent attacks and drove west, hoping to intercept the remaining lions. He stayed in the village of Halali and set out before dawn, heading east on foot to cross paths with the lions. After 6 hours of searching with no results, he returned to the village only to learn that the lions had attacked in his absence, killing an elderly man. 2 villagers, a 16-year-old boy armed with a spear and an older man, agreed to help him track the lions. The dense bush swallowed them whole, a suffocating maze where shadows whispered danger. George, armed with his rifle, led the way, his every step a gamble. The boy, silent, sharp-eyed, and resolute, was their guide. His father had been among the lion's victims, and vengeance fueled him. They tracked the predators with the boy's uncanny skill, their footprints etched like sinister hieroglyphs in the earth. The trail wove through the thick bush, where visibility shrank to mere feet. Every rustle of leaves could be the wind or death. Then came a sound, soft, almost imperceptible, a faint exhale that froze their breath in their lungs. George raised a hand, a silent command to halt. He dropped to his knees, rifle at the ready, and crawled forward, the weight of the moment pressing down like a shroud. Less than 5 yards ahead, the undergrowth parted to reveal a lioness. She lay stretched out, her golden eyes locked onto George with an unnerving calm. She didn't charge, didn't flee. Was she sated, curious, or simply toying with him? George didn't wait to find out. He steadied his aim and fired. The crack of the rifle shattered the stillness, and the lioness slumped, her eyes glazing over. As George reached to reload, a blur of motion erupted from the bush. Another lioness, a streak of fury and muscle, charged at him with deadly intent. George barely had time to raise his weapon. He fired again, the shot reverberating through the bush as the lioness crumpled mid-leap, her momentum carrying her lifeless body to his feet. The older man fled in terror, disappearing into the bush, but the boy stood his ground, spear at the ready, his resolve unshaken. The second lioness lay on the ground, her sides heaving, a guttural growl rumbling from her throat. She was gravely injured, but still dangerous. Nearby, the grass rustled ominously, hinting at more lions lurking just out of sight. George lit his pipe, the embers glow a fragile beacon in the encroaching darkness. He inhaled deeply, his nerves fraying under the tension of the unseen threat. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, the growling ceased. With painstaking caution, George approached the fallen lioness, his rifle ready for another shot. The boy stepped forward, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. "May I?" he asked, holding his spear with purpose. George looked at him, puzzled. "Why?" "She killed my father," the boy said, his voice carrying a quiet fury. George nodded grimly. "Make it quick." The boy drove his spear into the lioness's heart, his expression resolute. It was not just an act of revenge, but a moment of closure, an end to a nightmare that had haunted his family. The battle was far from over. The man-eater's reign of terror had been diminished, but not extinguished. Determined to finish the job, George sought out the local chieftain, Jafiki, and together they devised a plan. One of George's game scouts had already eliminated another man-eater, and the attacks had become less frequent. Still, they estimated that 2 or 3 killers remained, prowling an area of about 15 square miles near the village of Njombe Musa. Days turned into a week as George and his team combed the wilderness. On the 8th day, fresh tracks led them to a pair of lions resting under a thorn tree. George recognized the male, a beast he had encountered before, its amber eyes seared into his memory. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Shots rang out and the lions fell, their bodies heavy with the finality of death. As George stood over the fallen male, a pang of melancholy pierced through the triumph. What had driven these magnificent creatures to become killers of men? Starvation, injury, or some unknowable despair? He knelt beside the lion, running a hand over its lifeless form, and sighed. It was a tragic end to a grim chapter, one born of desperation on both sides of the primal divide. Though George believed the crisis was over, a few months later he received a telegram from Wenbon Smith informing him of another attack. Unable to return immediately, George instructed his scouts to hunt down the culprits. By July, the scouts had killed 2 female lions suspected to be man-eaters, and life in the affected villages began returning to normal. In total, George and his team had eliminated 22 lions, 15 of which were confirmed man-eaters. The question remains, why did this happen? One prevailing theory suggests the colonial government's efforts to combat rinderpest, including a massive fence that disrupted wildlife populations, may have forced the lions to turn to humans as a food source. Another possibility is that human activities or even malevolent influence could have played a role in driving the lions to such behavior. This grim chapter highlights the complex interplay between humans and wildlife. While the lions were ultimately driven to man-eating, likely due to a combination of environmental and human factors, their threat had to be addressed. Lions today remain vulnerable, having lost over 90% of their historic range. Efforts to protect these majestic animals must also consider the needs and safety of local communities. Thanks for watching. Leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed.